Hi everyone, now that we're starting with speeches, we're going to be going over how to do research, as this speech does require a research component. So we're going to look at what research is, why you should do it, and the correct way to do research. So when we look at research, one of the big questions you might have is, what is the purpose of doing research? Why should we do that? And so when you're constructing a persuasive argument, actually doing research is one of the most important aspects of constructing your persuasive argument. One of the reasons is that when you are researching a topic, that makes you become more knowledgeable about it. By doing reading on a specific topic, you inevitably learn more about it. And that will give you an additional degree of confidence to actually make your arguments and make sure that your arguments are based in fact. Another reason is so that you're going to be sure that your claims are true, and you'll have a background in looking at some of the facts that go along with the claims that you're making, so that you know you're not going to use any false information to support your arguments. But also, when you do research, that strengthens both the pathos and ethos components of a persuasive argument. So if you remember from before, ethos is credibility and logos is logic. So research's relationship to ethos comes from, or the need for additional ethos through research is because when people have an opposing viewpoint and you're trying to convince them with something they don't initially agree with, they're more likely to believe what you're trying to tell them, and they will be more receptive of arguments that they disagree with if the information comes from a credible source. And so there are a couple of ways to establish credibility, but unfortunately none of them are particularly easy, and they're very time-consuming. So to establish yourself as a credible source of information, there are 3 ways here I have examples of. So you can spend decades working in a particular field and collecting data to develop your own expertise on a particular topic. Or you can go to a highly prestigious school like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Oxford, places like that, and get your education there. Or you can just have extremely advanced degrees, like a PhD, a medical degree. You could be a lawyer and get a Juris Doctorate or a medical doctorate. But all of that takes a lot of time, and it's very difficult. Obviously, not everyone can go to Harvard or Princeton or Yale, and not everyone is going to get a PhD or become a medical doctor or become a lawyer. So these are not very practical ways to establish credibility for the purpose of constructing a persuasive argument. But when you use research, that's a way that you can borrow the credibility that someone else has already established by doing these kinds of things, by working in a specific field for decades and growing their expertise through professional experience or through education with advanced degrees at highly prestigious institutions. So there are experts who invest all of this time and effort into establishing their own credibility by getting educations and collecting data and publishing original research. And so all of that is available for people to just read and learn from. And so when you use an expert's research in your arguments, you also gain some of their credibility, and you don't have to spend all that time building your own credibility, which takes just an insane amount of time. And so that's one way to borrow credibility very quickly from someone who's already done the work to establish their own credibility. And having credibility is very important when you're going to make claims and try to convince somebody that you are being honest and you're trying to persuade them to believe or do something that you want them to. As an example, I'm showing a claim that I'm going to try to convince you is true, and see the role that ethos has in determining whether or not you are receptive to the idea. So the claim is, human beings evolved from alien bacteria carried by asteroids that landed on Earth. This is something said by Gerald, a homeless man, pictured on the right. Now, you're probably thinking that's completely absurd, and there's no way that can possibly be true, and there's no chance whatsoever that you would listen to this person. You would not even consider the possibility that this could be true. If, however, a different person with a certain amount of credentials says the same thing, this man, Dr. Fred Hoyle, who is an astronomer at the University of Cambridge, says human beings evolved from alien bacteria carried by asteroids that landed on Earth. Even though it's the exact same claim, if it's attributed to a different person with credentials, even if you don't automatically believe the idea, you are more likely to at least consider the possibility that it is based in fact. And actually, there's a little bit of a fun fact about this specific claim. This is a legitimate theory proposed by Dr. Hoyle regarding the origin of life on Earth. And the name of this theory is called panspermia. And so I have a couple of links here to Wikipedia if you would like to read more about that. But this is actually a genuine scientific theory proposed by somebody who taught at the University of Cambridge and has a doctorate in astronomy. So this is an actual scientific hypothesis that people accept about the origin of life on Earth. The fact that you can see this claim proposed by somebody with credentials means that you are more likely to accept the possibility that this could be true, and that is purely the effect of ethos. You remember, as compared to a man in a tinfoil hat who is homeless, you automatically assume that that is completely delusional, but it's actually a valid scientific theory. Research also has a relationship with logos. So when you conduct research, that allows you to locate facts, data, and statistics, which you can use as evidence to support whatever claims you're making in your persuasive argument. You need to remember that when you're trying to persuade somebody to accept your point of view, they often will not be convinced just by having you state facts and tell them that things are true. So when you do research and you happen to find facts and you get data and statistics and things like that, by going through the process of doing research, you are able to take the facts and data and statistics that you find and actually show them to your audience instead of just telling them that a particular claim is true. So again, I'll show you an example of this. So I can make the claim, for example, to address the belief that climate change is not a real thing, or something like that. So I can simply tell a group of people that don't believe in climate change that the world's annual CO2 emissions have increased by 3,216% since 1900. That's something I could simply tell them, and because that number is so high, they may not want to believe that that is true. But through the process of doing research, I can actually find data and a graph here to actually show this happening. And so in 1900, the CO2 emissions for the entire world was 1.09 billion tons of CO2. And in 2017, that increased to 36.15 billion tons. And if you actually calculate the difference between those, the increase is right around 3,216%. So it's a very significant increase in the amount of CO2 that's being produced every year in the world. And now that I have the ability to show this by doing research, it becomes a lot more clear and effective, and the possibility that it will be accepted by an audience is significantly higher because they have something to look at and verify visually instead of just believing a statistic that I am reciting to them. So when you are going to do research, it's always important to make sure that your research is reliable. So obviously you need to include research in your arguments, not only to borrow credibility, but also to gain access to data that you can physically show your audience so that they have access to evidence and are able to judge it by themselves. But the source of the information is just as important. You want to make sure that you're borrowing credibility from somebody that actually deserves to be viewed as credible. So the place where you get your information from matters as well, not just the fact that you have research, but the quality of your research is important as well. So if we look at two claims that are identical, but if we attribute them to different places, you can see that the effect is going to be very different. So this is an example of taking a quote from one place. ConspiracyJunkie.com states on their Bush did 9/11 page, while there is no evidence to suggest that President George Bush in any way sponsored or organized the September 11th attack, we have found that he was given ample warning to prevent the incident and deliberately refused to take action. Bush's personal communications indicate this may be because he wanted an act of terrorism to provoke the United States into a war in the Middle East, an area containing vital resources such as crude oil. Now, if we compare that to this, the Federal Bureau of Investigation states in the report by the 9/11 Commission the exact same thing. Now, if we go back, the first place cites ConspiracyJunkie.com. This is a random website that anybody can create, and it specifically is targeted towards people who are really interested in conspiracy theories. Often, conspiracy theories are completely ridiculous, and they're based in a general distrust in government bodies. So people automatically just reject anything that a government agency will tell them, and so citing this particular source inherently inserts distrust in whatever it says. However, by citing specifically the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is a government agency in the United States, that's significantly more credible. Now, I should point out that this is entirely made up. I completely fabricated these quotes, so ConspiracyJunkie.com is not even a real website, I don't think, and these exact words are not found there, and the 9/11 Commission's report on the September 11th attack does not contain this information either. It's entirely made up. Just want to make sure everyone knows that. I made this up. But the point still remains valid that the source of your information is important. So if you gather information from a reputable source, people are much more likely to believe that what you're saying is true. So that's a comparison between citing the FBI and citing ConspiracyJunkie.com, or similar websites that anyone can make and write whatever they want. Alright, so the point is that the sources that you cite matter. And so when you use research to borrow credibility from someone, you need to make sure that their credibility has value. And so these are some sites I just want to warn everybody about in case they happen to find them while doing research for your speeches. Because there are some very specific sites. There are obviously ones that you will probably instinctively know are untrustworthy, but some of them are specific to the US, and not everyone may be familiar with these particular sources that are generally viewed as unreliable. There are a couple of news sources that have a reputation for completely disregarding the truth in order to further some kind of political agenda. I'm not aware of as many like Democratic or liberal news sites that do this, but a lot of the Republican or conservative news sites are particularly famous for this kind of behavior. So 3 of them that you should avoid at absolutely all costs are Breitbart News, InfoWars, and Fox News. By far, Breitbart and InfoWars are much worse with this than Fox News, but still all 3 of them are generally considered to be unreliable, especially when reporting on issues that are viewed as political. So I would just completely avoid them so you don't have to worry about that kind of problem. There are also publications that exist as satire, and so the only purpose for their existence is comedic entertainment. And so satirical news sources write completely false and actually absurd articles. And some of the big ones in the US are The Onion, The Babylon Bee, and Weekly World News. Anything printed in these articles is fake, and it is deliberately untrue. The purpose is to make up exaggerated lies for people to read as entertainment. So they're not intended to be factually accurate or to be used as information. So nothing you cite in your persuasive speech should be from Breitbart, InfoWars, Fox News, The Onion, The Babylon Bee, or World Weekly News. You should avoid those completely, because some of them are deliberately false and others are not viewed as reputable. Generally, people tend to cite either major newspapers, government agencies, or certain websites like those that end with .edu, .org, or .gov. So major newspapers like the New York Times, the LA Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, usually you can pick a major city in the US, so New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Boston, Chicago. Any of those places, you can pretty safely cite newspapers that are published there. And websites that are nonprofit or educational institutions or run by the government are also generally trusted, but there are some very specific exceptions to the generalization that you can trust any .org, .gov, or .edu. So one example is 911truth.org. The purpose of 911truth.org is to suggest that the terrorist attack on September 11th in the United States was sponsored by the United States government, and the U.S. government was in some way responsible for organizing the attack. So one way that you can sort of look to verify if a particular source is reliable or not is to go to their website. And so this is 911truth.org. And just from glance, you can you might get the sense that this is a legitimate source of information. But one way that you can check to see if the information there is actually legitimate is to go through the actual article, and you can look at some of the links. So a lot of news articles now will contain links that go to other news stories. And if you look at a place like 911truth.org and you open their links, all of them just link back to 911truth. We go here to this one. We're still on 911truth. We can just open a few more, and they're all going to be to 911truth. So what this suggests is that the only people that support the claims that they're making are themselves. So the only people that 911truth can cite as being factually accurate are themselves. If we compare that to this story by the New York Times, go away, we see these links here go to lots of different places. So just in the first paragraph, New York Times has links to a government agency in California that's job is to look at fires and how all that works. This goes to, not sure exactly where, but this goes to a .edu, so this is scientific research on fires in the United States. This one goes to the New York Times, which isn't automatically a bad thing. This goes to BBC News, and they have another one to New York Times. But you can see they actually specifically refer to outside sources, whereas 911truth which is a conspiracy website, can only refer to itself to validate its information. And so that's one way you can try to tell if the information you're seeing from a particular source is reliable. Another place you can look for information, specifically more for like facts, figures, data, and statistics, is Google Scholar. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Google Scholar already, but all you really have to do to find Google Scholar is just Google the phrase Google Scholar, and it should take you right to where you need to go, and look through there for academic journals. So when an article is published in an academic journal, it goes through a very extensive and very rigorous review process that is actually checked for factual accuracy by experts in the field relevant to the academic journal. So if you try to publish something in an academic psychology journal, it's going to be reviewed by psychology experts. So information in academic journals is completely reliable always. So after you find your research and you made sure that it is reliable, that after you've done that, then you can construct a specific argument, either for or against a specific course of action. So, for example, you can't say this because I specifically said you can't talk about guns, but the process would be first you find research, then you can say we should have stricter gun laws or less strict gun laws, and once you've had that specific argument formulated, then you can implement your research as support. And so there are two common ways so that you can use research as support for your argument. One is by paraphrasing, and the other is a direct quote. So I'm going to demonstrate the process of paraphrasing and direct quoting with a paragraph I have down here, which I took from NPR. So the paragraph says, a solid majority of Americans say they are in favor of stricter gun laws in the United States. 61% said so in a May Quinnipiac poll. I don't know if I said that right. I probably didn't. But the breakdown by party is illuminating. 91% of Democrats think gun laws should be stricter, as do 59% of independents, and just 32% of Republicans. So that's the paragraph we're going to use to paraphrase or quote. So when you paraphrase a source, what you do is essentially you take the idea that somebody said or used or information that they have conveyed, and you put it into different words. So an example of a paraphrase with this paragraph would be, around 60% of Americans support increased gun control, though the numbers look quite different when considering political affiliation. 91% of Democrats and 59% of independents believe we need more restrictive gun laws. Only 32% of Republicans think such changes are necessary. Right, so here you can see the paragraph that I've written has the same ideas and information, and it follows the same sort of structure as the original paragraph. But when you read the two paragraphs, you get the exact same information and you have the same ideas. I've just put those ideas in my own words. And when you have a direct quote, basically all you do is you copy the exact wording that's used by a source previously. So if you look at this paragraph, it's the exact same thing again, and it just has quotation marks around it. So that's copying word for word exactly what somebody else said. Usually people only use a direct quote when there's something specific about the exact wording in a source that they cannot, is less powerful or can't be conveyed any other way. So you would only use quotes when it's absolutely necessary. If there's no way to rephrase what someone else said, or the way it was phrased specifically gives that particular quote, if that makes it significantly stronger, then you can use a quote, but otherwise you should always paraphrase. So whenever you quote a source or you paraphrase a source, you need to indicate where the information came from. And there are 2 times every time you cite something that a source needs to be cited. So one is immediately after you use a quote or you paraphrase a source. And so when you do this immediately after a quote or a paraphrase, this is called a parenthetical reference. And I'm going to go into more detail about these in a bit. And then at the end of an essay, where you might be more familiar with it, or in the case where it's a speech, this will go at the end of your PowerPoint. So when you cite something at the end of a PowerPoint, that's called the bibliography, or it's called a works cited or a reference page. So every time you take information from another source, you need to say where the information came from, immediately after you use it, and then once at the end with everything else. So we're going to talk about a bibliography first. So the purpose of a bibliography is to provide a full list of sources that you used throughout your argument. And it goes at the very end of whatever you're doing. So if it's an essay, that's its own separate page at the very end. Or if it's PowerPoint, it's going to be your last slide at the end of your presentation. And you provide bibliographies for 2 reasons. First is to give credit to information, give credit to sources that you took any information or ideas from. Suggesting that other people's ideas came from you is dishonest, and academics have absolutely no tolerance for that kind of behavior. Another reason that you provide a bibliography is to give your audience an opportunity to fact-check the claims and any evidence you use to support them, so that they can independently verify that what you are saying is true, and they can verify that the evidence you cited actually says what you claim that it does. So by giving them a bibliography, it provides them everything they need to be able to find the sources of information that you used for your argument. And so when you write a bibliography, the information needs to include these things. You need to have the author's name, the date of publication, the title of the article or the story or whatever, the name of the publication, so whatever it's published by, and then if it's an online source, you need a website URL, or if it's a printed source, you need page numbers. So we'll have an example of this. The article from NPR that I've been using was written by, Domenico Montanaro, something like that. The article was published on August 10th, 2019. The title of the article is Americans Largely Support Gun Restrictions to Do Something About Gun Violence. And the article was published by NPR. So, when we go to write the bibliography citation, first we write the author's last name. So, when you write the author's name, which comes first, you put the last name, then a comma, then their first name, and then a period. After that, you include the year that a specific article was published. So because this NPR article was published in 2019, you just put 2019, then another period. After that, you put the title of the article. So this doesn't need any punctuation around it. You just write the title of the article and whatever punctuation was contained in the title of the article. So in this example, the quotes around do something was part of the article. Right, so because the title of the article was Americans Largely Support Gun Restrictions to Do Something About Gun Violence, that goes after, and again you end it with a period. Then after the title of the article, you say who the article was published by, so this would be NPR. When you say who the article was published by, you put the name of that in italics, so that's the slanted writing. Then, after that, you put the URL. So this is the link, when it's a web source, that someone can just, click on or copy and paste so that they can just be taken directly to the website where you found the information. So after you have a whole bunch of sources and you put them together, and you have gathered all the sources, you need to provide this citation all at once at the end. So this is what a bibliography should look like. As you see, all of these I've included here have last name, first name, year, title of the article, place of publication, and since these are all print sources, I just have page numbers. But if they were websites, I would include URLs instead of page numbers. So this is very important. I've always had trouble with people doing bibliographies. This is what a bibliography should look like. When you cite something, you need to include first and last name, year, title of the article, publication, page numbers, or URL. This is not what a bibliography looks like. These are all links that will take you directly to the papers that I used. However, this is not a bibliography. This is just a series of links. So, when I require you to do a bibliography, I will not accept a list of links. When you do a bibliography, it needs to be this. Has to be last name, first name, year, title of the article, publication, page number, or URL. If you just send me a list of links, I will not accept it, and you will not get credit for it. So it's very important, when you use research, you need to include a bibliography that looks like this, not one that looks like this. Alright, so, in addition to compiling a bibliography, you also need to cite sources immediately after you use the information that you borrowed from the particular source. And depending on whether you paraphrase or quote information, that looks slightly different. So when you're paraphrasing information, which is what you should be doing mostly, you put the author's last name and the date of the publication in parentheses after whatever information you borrowed. And if it's a quote, you basically do the same thing, and you add a page number only if it's a print source. So that may sound a little complicated, so I'm just going to show you what it should look like. So our paraphrase of the paragraph from NPR, again, around 60% of Americans support increased gun control, though the numbers look quite different when considering political affiliation, blah, blah, blah. So that's the information that I've paraphrased, and so we can just start there. First, we paraphrase the information. And now that we've written our own version of the paragraph from NPR, then we add the author's last name, and that goes in parentheses. Then, after we have the author's last name, we put the year that the article was published, also inside the parentheses after the author's name. You do not need a comma or any kind of punctuation between the last name and the year. The last thing I should point out is that this goes before the period at the end of the sentence. So it should be all of your paraphrased information, then parentheses, author's name, year, close parentheses, then your period. When you do a quote, it's basically the exact same thing. The overall process for the parenthetical reference. But with a quote, instead you copy the phrasing exactly, and you need to put quotation marks around the entire thing. After you do that, you need parentheses again with the author's last name and the year. When you are quoting a print source, you also need to include a page number. But remember, this is only if you are directly quoting a print source. So when you paraphrase a print source, you do not need page numbers. When you directly quote a print source, you do need page numbers. But always, no matter what, at the very least, you need the author's name and the year that the work was published. And this is part of why plagiarism is part of why proper citation is so important. So, hopefully most of you are already familiar with the concept of plagiarism and you know how to avoid it, but that may not be the case for everyone. And I don't tolerate plagiarism in any form, accidental or otherwise, so I just want to make sure everyone is aware of plagiarism what plagiarism is and what plagiarism is not. So plagiarism is a kind of cheating. Most of the kinds of cheating people are familiar with are just copying somebody's homework or copying on a test or like stealing answers for a test or whatever. Plagiarism is another form of cheating where you take someone else's ideas and present them as though they were your own. So you pretend you had ideas that you took from someone else. It's basically a way of not doing your own work and taking work somebody else did. So it's stealing. When you do that, you do not have to deliberately or have negative intentions when you steal information and ideas to be guilty of plagiarism. So even if you take ideas from somebody else and you don't know what's wrong or you don't know the correct way to give credit, it's still plagiarism. So ignorance does not excuse you from being guilty of plagiarizing somebody else's work. So anytime that you take an idea or information from another source without giving them proper credit, that is an act of plagiarism. So I'm going to show you now some examples of plagiarism. As I've showed you before, paraphrasing is perfectly fine, but you have to give credit. So if I take our NPR paragraph and then I write my paraphrase of it, this is plagiarism, what I'm showing you now. Because there is no parenthetical reference, right? We don't have the author's name and the year in parentheses at the end. And because we're missing that, this is plagiarism. Even if you accidentally forget to include the parenthetical reference, and you intended to give credit, and you did the research, and you have all that, if you don't include the parenthetical reference immediately after the paraphrase, this is plagiarism. Now, we have an example of a quote where we directly copy the information from our source. So we copy it word for word, and we put it in our new work. And so because these words are copied directly and there are no quotation marks, this is plagiarism, regardless of whether you are actually trying to steal from someone or get out of doing work. You copied words directly from somebody else, and so that is plagiarism. Now, suppose that we copy word for word from a source and there are quotation marks around the section that we've copied. There are quotation marks, which seems to suggest that you intend to give credit to the original author, but you forget the parenthetical reference. That is still plagiarism. Without the parenthetical reference, you are stealing information, even if you put quotes around it, even if you paraphrase it. You need the parenthetical reference, otherwise, any time you take information from somewhere and you don't give credit, it is plagiarism. There's something I want to say specifically about paraphrasing, because I get the sense that some people think that if they change the wording of the information sufficiently, then they don't need to give credit to a source, but that is not true. No matter how much you change the exact wording of information from a source, you still need to give credit to the original author. And so the example I have below, which is another paraphrase, is still plagiarism if it's not cited properly. So instead of the paraphrase I used before, this new paragraph is still plagiarism because I don't give credit. It says, nearly all liberals, just over 90%, want greater regulations of firearms, while only 1/3 of conservatives share this belief. A larger portion of third-party supporters, at 59%, desire more restrictive gun legislation. In total, around 60% of people in the U.S. across the political spectrum advocate for increased gun control. Now, when I wrote this, I intentionally tried to avoid using any of the words in the paragraph. I couldn't avoid that entirely, but the only words that the paragraph I wrote shares in common with the article from NPR is the word percent, the word of, the word a, party, 59, gun, in, and the. All of those words, just by themselves, aren't automatically plagiarism. But as you can see, I used almost none of the words from this original paragraph. The problem is, it still means the same thing. Even though I rearranged the sentences and I changed the structure and I used almost none of the same words, I'm still taking the idea and the meaning and the information. Because the ideas and information and meaning came from somewhere else, I still need to cite it. It doesn't matter what words I use, I need to give credit to the source of the idea and the information. So, just to make sure everyone is aware, anytime any information comes from anywhere other than your brain, you need to give credit to the source of the information. If you do not, that is plagiarism. It doesn't matter what your intentions were or whether you knew that it was wrong or you didn't know how to do it correctly. It is plagiarism. So, make sure anytime you take an idea from anywhere, you give credit to the original author. So that's all I have on research and citations and all that. If you have questions, you can always email me to get some clarification about plagiarism and citations and doing research. I'm going to have you start doing your own research now and actually go and choose a topic to give your speeches on, so that'll be coming up soon. And that's all I have for today, so hopefully that was helpful, and if you need help doing your research, you can always email me, and I will try to give you guidance as best as I can. So, new video, when? What day is it? It's Thursday? New video Monday, alright? See you guys then.